Every park ranger learns two sets of rules, the ones in the handbook and the ones nobody writes down. Rules like, if you find a staircase standing alone in the woods, you don't climb it. If a lake starts glowing from underneath after dark, you don't stay to watch. And if a voice comes through a radio from a tower that's been abandoned for decades, you don't answer. Welcome to the faint whisper, where missing person files don't end. They echo. Tonight, we're bringing you 5 park ranger stories that sound like lies, until you hear the way the witnesses describe them, because some parts of the wilderness don't just hide danger, they remember you.
We have breaking news tonight out of the Oregon wilderness. The search for missing hiker Marcus Henley has officially been suspended.
Jennifer Hartwell had been a park ranger at a remote section of the Pacific Northwest wilderness for 3 years when she encountered something that made her seriously consider quitting. It was a Wednesday in late September, and she was conducting a routine trail inspection about 8 miles from the nearest road. The afternoon sun filtered through the Douglas firs in golden shafts, and everything seemed perfectly normal until she rounded a bend and saw it. There, in the middle of the forest, at least 200 yards from any trail or structure, stood a perfectly preserved staircase. It rose 15 feet into the air, carpeted in deep red fabric that looked almost new, despite being completely exposed to the elements. The wooden banister gleamed with fresh polish. Jennifer stood frozen, her radio suddenly feeling very heavy on her hip. She'd heard the rumors during training, the stories the older rangers told the new recruits late at night. Don't go near the staircase ATAs, don't touch them, don't photograph them, and for God's sake, don't climb them. She'd laughed it off as Macy's hazing, an inside joke to unnerve the rookies. But here one stood, utterly impossible and utterly real. Jennifer circled the structure, her boots crunching on pine needles. The staircase had no visible foundation, no supports, nothing to explain how it remained upright. It simply existed, a fragment of someone's home torn from reality and planted in the wilderness like a grotesque sculpture. She pulled out her radio to report it, but before she could press the talk button, she heard footsteps on the stairs. The sound was unmistakable, the soft pad of bare feet on carpet, descending slowly, one step at a time. But there was nothing visible on the stairs. No person, no animal. Nothing to explain the sound or the way the carpet fibers compressed under invisible weight. Jennifer's training told her to investigate, but every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run. She compromised. She backed away slowly, keeping her eyes on the staircase, her hand hovering near the canister of bear spray on her belt. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then the temperature dropped so suddenly that Jennifer could see her breath misting in the air. September in the Pacific Northwest could be cool, but this was different. This was the cold of deep winter, of meat lockers, of graves. Something moved in her peripheral vision. Jennifer turned her head slightly, just enough to see without taking her eyes completely off the staircases. There were more of them. At least a dozen staircases scattered through the trees in every direction. Each one different, each one impossible. A spiral staircase of wrought iron, a grand wooden staircase with carved banisters, a modern concrete staircase that belonged in a parking garage. They hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. She was certain of it. The bare footsteps began again, but this time they were all around her, echoing from every staircase simultaneously. Up and down, a rhythm that matched no human gait. Jennifer's nerve broke. She ran, crashing through undergrowth, her radio bouncing against her side. She ran until her lungs burned, until she burst out onto the main trail, until she could see other hikers in the distance. When she finally worked up the courage to report what she'd seen, her supervisor's face went pale. He pulled out a filing cabinet that Jennifer had never noticed before and extracted a worn manila folder marked only with a red S. Inside were dozens of reports spanning decades, all describing the same phenomenon. Staircases appearing in the wilderness, always far from any structure, always accompanied by the sound of footsteps, always generating a sense of overwhelming dread. The supervisor told Jennifer what he'd been told when he first encountered one. There's a protocol. If you see a staircase, you mark the coordinates, you back away, and you do not, under any circumstances, touch it or climb it. When Jennifer asked why, her supervisor showed her the last page in the folder. It was a missing persons report from 1998. A ranger named Thomas Killian had disappeared while on patrol. His last radio transmission, recorded but never released to the public, was barely audible, over waves of static. But the transcript was clear enough. "I'm on the staircase now," Thomas had said, his voice dreamy and distant. "I can see the door at the top. I'm going to knock. I'm going to see who's home." Thomas Killian was never seen again. But for years afterward, rangers reported hearing knocking sounds emanating from staircases in that section of the forest. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Always the same pattern. Always unanswered. Jennifer transferred to a different park. 6 months later, she still hikes, still loves the wilderness. But she carries a compass now and checks it obsessively. Because the one detail she left out of her official report, the detail that still wakes her up at night, is what she saw when she glanced back one final time before leaving the forest that day. At the top of the red-carpeted staircase, barely visible against the sky, was a door, and it was opening. Daniel Reeves thought he'd seen everything during his 15 years as a ranger in the Rockies. He'd handled bear encounters, rescued stranded climbers, and once spent 3 days tracking down a confunct elk that had somehow gotten itself wedged between 2 trees. But nothing in his experience prepared him for the 3 nights in July when Mirror Lake stopped being just a lake. Mirror Lake earned its name honestly. On calm days, the water's surface reflected the surrounding peaks with such perfect clarity that it was almost impossible to tell where reality ended and reflection began. It was a popular destination for photographers, and Daniel made the hike up to the lake several times a week during tourist season to check on campers and ensure everyone was following leave-no-trace principles. On a Tuesday evening, he arrived at the lake to find a group of campers frantically packing their gear in the fading light. They were a family from Denver, experienced outdoors people, but the father's hands were shaking so badly he could barely zip his tent bag. When Daniel asked what was wrong, the man just pointed at the lake and said, "Wait till dark. You'll see." Daniel tried to convince them to stay, worried about them hiking down the mountain trail in darkness, but they refused. They practically fled, and Daniel was left alone at the lake as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. He made a mental note to file a report about the family's strange behavior, but figured they had probably just spooked themselves with wildlife sounds or shadows. Then night fell completely, and Daniel understood. The lights began appearing in the lake around 9 p.m., not reflections of stars or the moon, but lights that seemed to originate from deep beneath the surface. They were geometric and precise, arranged in patterns that shifted and reconfigured, like a massive underwater city coming to life. Daniel stood at the shore, his flashlight hanging useless in his hand, watching streets of light form and dissolve in the depths. He radioed down to the ranger station, trying to keep his voice steady as he described what he was seeing. His supervisor, Tom Chen, told him to stay put and keep observing. Tom would hike up with equipment to document the phenomenon. Daniel agreed, even though every fiber of his being wanted to leave. The lights grew brighter over the next hour, and Daniel began to see shapes moving among them. They were too large to be fish, and moved with a purpose that seemed almost deliberate. More disturbing was the sound that began to emanate from the water, a low humming that he felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, and it made his teeth ache. Then the surface of the lake began to glow with a pale blue-green luminescence. In the eerie light, Daniel could see that the water level was dropping, not draining away, but somehow compressing, as if the lake were being pulled down into itself. The shoreline remained wet, but the water receded foot by foot, revealing the lake bed. What Daniel saw in the exposed mud made him stumble backward. There were structures down there, angular and metallic, arranged in the same geometric patterns as the lights. They looked technological, but weathered and ancient at the same time, and they were clearly not natural formations. The most disturbing element was the doorways. Each structure had openings that looked almost like doors or hatches, and from these openings, pale blue light spilled out onto the lake bed. Daniel's radio crackled with Tom's voice saying he was 20 minutes away, but Daniel couldn't respond. He was transfixed by what emerged from one of the doorways. It was humanoid in the vaguest sense, tall and impossibly thin, its skin or surface reflecting light in a way that made it difficult to look at directly. It moved with a strange jerking gait across the exposed lake bed, and Daniel realized with creeping horror that it was moving toward the shore. Toward him. His paralysis broke. Daniel ran, not down the trail, but laterally around the lake, putting distance between himself and the thing that was approaching. He didn't stop until he was on the opposite shore, gasping for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he looked back across the lake, he could see at least 3 more figures had emerged from the structures. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The water rushed back in with a sound like a massive inhalation. The structures vanished beneath the surface, and the lights winked out one by one. Within 30 seconds, Mirror Lake looked exactly as it always had. Peaceful, dark, and perfectly ordinary. Tom arrived 20 minutes later to find Daniel sitting on a rock, staring at the water. When Daniel told him what he'd witnessed, Tom didn't seem surprised. He pulled out a thermos of coffee and told Daniel a story. In the 1950s, there had been a geological survey of the area. The team had used primitive sonar equipment to map the lake bottom, expecting to find a typical mountain lake basin. Instead, they discovered that Mirror Lake had no bottom. Or rather, the bottom was so far down that their equipment couldn't detect it. The lake, which appeared to be perhaps 100 feet deep at most, was somehow impossibly deep. The surveyor's report was classified. The lead scientist was transferred to a different project, and Mirror Lake was designated as a protected area where no further surveying would be permitted. Over the decades, there had been occasional reports. Lights in the water, strange sounds, campers who swore they saw things moving beneath the surface. But official policy was to dismiss these as natural phenomena, wildlife, or overactive imaginations. Daniel asked Tom why rangers were never warned about this. Tom's answer was a simple and chilling. Because knowing changes how you act around it. And the last thing we want is for it to realize we know it's there. Daniel continued working as a ranger, but he never returned to Mirror Lake. The Park Service assigned those patrols to other rangers without explanation, and Daniel didn't object. He has, however, started paying attention to lakes in general, because 3 months after the incident at Mirror Lake, he was hiking near a completely different lake 40 miles away and saw, just for a moment, as the sun set, a faint geometric glow emanating from deep beneath the surface. He didn't stop to watch. He just kept walking. Sarah Motzkin's encounter began with a simple radio call. It was a Saturday in October, and she was manning the ranger station at the northern entrance to a sprawling wilderness preserve in Montana. The voice that crackled over the radio was calm and professional, identifying itself as Ranger David Keller, calling in from the old fire lookout tower, about 12 miles into the backcountry. Sarah knew every ranger in the district, and there was no David Keller. She checked the roster to be sure, but her memory was correct. She called back, asking the ranger to repeat his name and badge number. The response came back clearly. David Keller, badge number 10847. Checking in from Fire Lookout 7 as per protocol. The problem was that Fire Lookout 7 had been decommissioned in 1973. The tower still stood, but it was locked and hadn't been staffed in over 40 years. And badge number 10847 didn't exist in the system. Sarah's supervisor, Marcus Webb, was in the station with her. He heard the exchange and his face went ashen. He grabbed the radio from Sarah's hand and asked David a series of questions. What was the current date? What year? Who was the president? The answers came back confused, increasingly distressed. David insisted it was October 15, 1982. He wanted to know why Marcus was asking such strange questions. He needed to report something unusual he'd observed in the forest. Marcus told David to stay at the lookout tower, and that help was coming. Then he gathered Sarah and 2 other rangers, Carl and Jennifer, and they drove as close to the tower as the fire roads allowed before hiking the remaining 3 miles. Marcus filled them in on the way. In 1982, there had been a ranger, David Keller. He'd been stationed at Fire Lookout 7. On October 15th, he'd radioed in to report unusual activity in the forest. Strange lights, what he described as a shimmering in the air like heat waves, and the feeling that he was being watched. He said he was going to investigate and would radio back within the hour. He never did. Search and rescue found the lookout tower, locked from the inside. David's coffee still warm, his jacket still hanging on its hook, but David himself was gone. The investigation concluded he'd somehow left the tower and gotten lost or injured in the wilderness. But his body was never recovered. Now, 43 years later, David was back on the radio as if no time had passed at all. The team reached the tower in the failing light of late afternoon. The structure was a 60-foot steel framework supporting a small cabin at the top, accessible only by a narrow staircase. The door at the base of the stairs was secured with a chain and padlock that showed 40 years of rust and weathering. It hadn't been opened in decades. Marcus called up to the tower on his radio. "David, we're here. We're at the base of the tower. Can you look out the window and see us?" There was a long pause. Then David's voice came back. "Kamosis Eden, I don't see anyone. Are you sure you're at Lookout 7? Wait, there's something strange. The lock on the door down there. It's rusted. It looks old. How is that possible? I locked that door this morning." Sarah felt ice water run down her spine. The voice on the radio was coming from the tower above them. But the tower was locked. Had been locked for decades. Then Carl pointed up at the windows of the lookout cabin. A light was moving inside. The beam of a flashlight sweeping across the glass. They all saw it. Someone was definitely in that tower. Marcus made a decision. They would break the lock and go up. If somehow someone had gotten into the tower and was playing an elaborate hoax, they'd arrest them. If something else was happening, well, they'd deal with that when they faced it. The lock broke easily, corroded by decades of weather. Marcus climbed first, his hand on his radio, calling out to David with each step. "We're coming up. Stay calm. Everything's going to be okay," David's voice responded, sounding panicked now. "Who's there?" "Someone's on the stairs. I can hear footsteps." "But I locked the door." "I know I locked it." The door to the lookout cabin was closed but not locked. Marcus pushed it open and stepped inside, flashlight raised. The cabin was empty. 40 years of dust covered every surface undisturbed. Cobwebs hung in the corners. The windows were filthy and opaque. The furniture was arranged as it had been when the tower was decommissioned. A desk, a chair, a cot, a small wood stove. No recent human presence. No David Keller. But on the desk, cutting through the dust, were fresh marks. Circular impressions where a coffee mug had recently sat. A clean rectangle where a logbook had been opened. And the radio, an ancient model from the 1980s that shouldn't have had any power, was warm to the touch. Marcus picked up the radio handset. "David, we're in the tower. Where are you?" The response came not from the radio, but from all around them, as if the tower itself was speaking. "I can hear you, but I can't see you. Something's wrong. The air is shimmering again. It's getting brighter. God, it's so bright. I'm going to go outside and..." The voice cut off abruptly, replaced by decades-old static. At the same moment, the fresh marks on the desk vanished as if they'd never been, and the radio went dead and dead. The team stood in silence, barely breathing. Finally, Sarah whispered, "Did we just hear his last words from 40 years ago?" Marcus had no answer. They searched the tower thoroughly, documented everything, and hiked back down as darkness fell. The incident was reported to the park superintendent, who filed it away in the same restricted cabinet where so many other unexplainable events were buried. But the story doesn't end there, because twice a year, on October 15th and again on April 22nd, the old radio at Fire Lookout 7 comes to life. Rangers have heard it, hikers have reported it, and each time the message is the same. David Keller calling in, requesting assistance, describing impossible things in the forest, and then his voice cutting off mid-sentence, replaced by static. A psychic who heard about the phenomenon offered an explanation that nobody wanted to hear. "Time," she said, "isn't as linear as we think." David Keller went into the forest on October 15, 1982, and encountered something that exists outside of normal time. He's still in that moment, still experiencing those final hours over and over, his distress call echoing forward through the decades like a recording that never stops playing. The Park Service officially denies that anything unusual occurs at Fire Lookout 7, but they've never torn the tower down, and they've never removed the old radio. And once a year, on the anniversary of David's disappearance, a ranger is quietly assigned to climb the tower, sit in that dusty cabin, and listen to the radio, just in case one time David says something different, just in case there's a way to bring him home. So far, the message never changes these days. But they keep listening, because what else can they do? Michael Torres had been warned about Dead Pine Valley before his first patrol there. It was a remote section of forest in Northern California, accessible only by a narrow fire road that washed out most winters. The valley had a reputation among the rangers, though no one would explain exactly why. They'd just shake their heads and tell him to trust his instincts. If something felt wrong, get out. Don't try to be a hero. Michael was an ex-Marine, a rational man who believed in concrete facts and logical explanations. He wasn't going to let superstitious co-workers spook him. So when he pulled into the valley on a clear June morning, he was determined to complete a thorough patrol and prove there was nothing to fear. The valley was beautiful in an eerie way. The dead pines that gave it its name stood like skeletal sentinels, their bare branches reaching toward the sky. They'd been killed by bark beetles decades ago, but the dry climate had preserved them, creating a strange ghost forest of gray wood. Younger trees had begun growing among the dead ones, creating an unsettling contrast of life and death. Michael hiked 3 miles into the valley, checking campsites and trails, finding nothing unusual. Just pristine wilderness and profound silence. That silence should have been his first warning. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Just the whisper of wind through dead branches and his own footsteps on the trail. He found the circle at the base of a small ridge. 32 dead pine trees arranged in a perfect ring, their trunks evenly spaced, their bases sunk into soft earth. In the center of the circle was a cleared area of bare dirt, and in that dirt were the toys. There were dozens of them. Action figures, a fuzz, toy trucks, stuffed animals, all arranged in a pattern that Michael couldn't quite decipher. They weren't weathered or heated. They looked new, as if they'd been placed there recently. But there were no footprints in the dirt except Michael's own. No sign that anyone had been in the valley for weeks. Michael approached the circle slowly, every instinct telling him this was wrong. Toys don't arrange themselves. People don't hike 3 miles into a remote valley to set up elaborate displays and leave no trace. He pulled out his camera to document the scene, but his hand was shaking. That's when he heard the laughter. High and bright, the unmistakable sound of children playing. It echoed from somewhere deep in the circle of dead pines. But when Michael spun around, there was no one there. Just the trees and the toys, and the suffocating silence that rushed back. In the moment the laughter stopped, Michael keyed his radio, suddenly desperate for the sound of another human voice. Static greeted him. He was too far into the valley, surrounded by ridges that blocked transmission. He was alone. The toys moved. Michael didn't see it happen, didn't see any of them physically relocate. But when he looked back at the circle, the arrangement was different. The action figures that had been lying down were now standing. The dolls that had faced away now faced him. It was subtle, but he was certain it had changed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Michael's breath misted in the air, and frost began forming on the dead grass around the circle. In June, in California, he backed away from the circle, keeping his eyes locked on those toys, watching for a movement. That's when he saw the children. They appeared at the edge of his vision, translucent and flickering like a bad television signal. 6 of them, ranging in age from maybe 5 to 12, wearing clothes from different eras. A little girl in a Victorian dress, a boy in 1950s shorts and suspenders, a teenager in 1970s bell-bottoms. They stood at the perimeter of the circle of trees, unmoving, watching him with dark, hollow eyes. Michael's training evaporated. He ran. He crashed through underbrush, leaped over fallen logs, sprinted back toward his truck, with a panic he'd never felt even in combat. Behind him, the laughter followed, but it had changed. It was no longer the innocent sound of playing children. It was mocking, cruel, hungry. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck. He jumped in, started the engine with shaking hands, and tore out of Dead Pine Valley, the fire road barely visible in his dust cloud. He didn't slow down until he was back on paved highway, didn't stop shaking until he reached the ranger station. His supervisor listened to his story with a grim expression. Then he pulled out the file on Dead Pine Valley, the one they didn't show to new rangers until they'd seen something for themselves. Inside were decades of reports. Hikers who'd found the circle and fled in terror. A Forest Service crew that refused to work in the valley after hearing children's voices. Most disturbingly, there were missing persons reports. Since 1923, 17 children had vanished in or near Dead Pine Valley. Different families, different circumstances, but always the same location. The searches had found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, no explanation. Just toys left behind in the forest that eventually found their way to the circle. Michael asked the obvious question. Why didn't they close the valley? Why not make it off limits? His supervisor's answer haunted him. We did for a while. In the 1970s, they shut down access completely. Know what happened? Kids started disappearing from other parts of the forest instead. It was like whatever's in Dead Pine Valley started hunting more actively when it couldn't lure people in. So we opened it back up and just tried to limit access, he says. Hope that it stays satisfied. Michael requested a transfer the next day. It was denied. Instead, he was told that since he'd survived an encounter in Dead Pine Valley, he was now one of the few rangers who could patrol it. The thing in the valley had seen him, had let him go, and that meant he had some kind of protection. Refusing to patrol there would mean someone else, someone unprepared, would have to go instead. Michael still works as a ranger. He patrols Dead Pine Valley twice a month, always during daylight, always alone. He's learned the rules through careful observation. Don't enter the circle. Don't touch the toys. If you hear laughter, acknowledge it politely and leave. The children seem to appreciate manners. He's also learned something more disturbing. Every few months, new toys appear in the circle. Fresh ones, modern ones. Toys that couldn't have been there for more than days or weeks. Michael documents them, photographs them. Files reports that no one outside a select few will ever read. And sometimes, late at night at his small apartment, Michael searches missing children databases. He's found 3 matches so far. 3 children who vanished from parks or campsites within 100 miles of Dead Pine Valley. 3 children whose favorite toys now sit in a circle of dead trees, waiting for them to come back and play. Michael has requested a transfer 4 more times. All 4 times, he's been denied. Because someone has to watch Dead Pine Valley. Someone has to count the toys and hope the number never increases too quickly. Someone has to bear witness. And Michael Torres, ex-Marine, rational man, believer in facts and logic, has learned that some duties transcend understanding. You don't have to comprehend a thing to know it must be guarded against. Rachel Kim's last normal day as a park ranger was a Thursday in March. She was closing down a wilderness trailhead at dusk, making sure all hikers had returned from the backcountry before the park gates locked for the night. She was checking the register, noting who had signed in and out, when a man approached from the trail. He looked normal enough. Hiking boots, backpack, fleece jacket, the typical gear. He was in his 40s, average height, with a pleasant face and an easy smile. He waved to Rachel as he approached. "Cutting it close," Rachel said, returning his smile. "We close the gates in 15 minutes. "I know," the man said. "I've done this hike many times. I know exactly how long it takes." Rachel made a note of his return in the register and was about to wish him a good evening when she noticed something odd. His boots were spotless. He'd just completed a 6-mile trail that included 2 stream crossings and a muddy section where a spring fed onto the path. Every hiker came back with dirty boots, but his looked like they'd just come out of the box. "The trail's in good condition?" she asked, testing. "Perfect," he replied. "A little muddy at mile 3, but nothing too bad." Rachel's hand drifted to her radio. The trail wasn't muddy at mile 3. The muddy section was at mile 4, and it had been that way for 2 weeks. Anyone who'd actually hiked the trail would know that. "Can I see your permit?" she asked, keeping her voice friendly. The man's smile didn't waver, but something in his eyes changed. They went flat and cold, like a shark's. "I don't need a permit. I've been hiking this trail longer than you've been alive. Everyone needs a day-use permit," Rachel said, her thumb hovering over the emergency button on her radio. "It's park regulation." The man tilted his head, studying her with those dead eyes. Then he did something that made Rachel's blood freeze. He bent backward at the waist, impossibly far, until his head hung upside down behind him, his spine bending in ways that no human spine should bend, all while maintaining eye contact with her and still smiling. Rachel hit the emergency button. The man straightened up as if nothing had happened, shouldered his backpack, and started walking toward the parking lot. Rachel followed at a distance, her hand on her pepper spray, speaking rapidly into her radio to dispatch. 2 rangers were on their way. 3 minutes out, the man reached the parking lot and walked directly to a truck. Rachel noted the license plate, noted the make and model. She watched him get in, start the engine, and drive toward the exit. He'd be at the gate in less than a minute, and her backup was still 2 minutes away. Then the man's truck reached the gate, and he stopped. He sat there, engine idling, not moving. When Rachel cautiously approached, she could see him gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He turned to look at her through the window, and his expression was anguished. "I can't leave." he said. And his voice was different now, desperate and human. God help me, I can't leave. The backup rangers arrived to find Rachel standing near the gate, maintaining distance from a truck whose driver was now slumped over the steering wheel, sobbing. When they approached the vehicle, the man looked up with tear-streaked cheeks and told them a story that should have been impossible. His name was Peter Stoll. In 1987, he'd gone hiking on this trail and never returned. Search and rescue had looked for him and for 2 weeks before calling off the search. He was declared dead in absentia, but Peter claimed he'd never left. He'd been walking this trail every day for 38 years. He'd watched the seasons change, watched the forest grow, watched rangers like Rachel come and go. He'd tried to leave countless times, but whenever he reached the gate, something stopped him, an invisible barrier he couldn't cross. During the day, he felt almost normal. He could interact with hikers if he wanted to, though most couldn't see him. But at night, things changed. At night, he wasn't alone on the trail. There were others, dozens of them, all trapped in the same loop, walking the same paths over and over. And there were things that hunted them in the darkness, things he couldn't describe, things that wore human shapes but moved wrong and smelled like rot and earth. The rangers exchanged glances. Peter Stoll was listed as a missing hiker from 1987. They'd all seen the old file, but the man in the truck looked 40 years old, not 78. He hadn't aged a day since he'd vanished. They tried to help Peter leave. They put him in a ranger vehicle and attempted to drive him out. The vehicle's engine died the moment it crossed the gate line with Peter inside. They tried walking him out on foot. He collapsed in agony the moment he stepped past the boundary, screaming about something pulling at him, dragging him back. Finally, as full darkness fell, Peter begged them to let him go back to the trail. "It's almost night," he said, his voice shaking with terror. "You don't want to see what happens at night. Please, just let me go back." They did. They watched Peter Stoll walk back toward the trailhead, his figure growing less distinct as he moved away from the lights. By the time he reached the trail entrance, he was translucent. And then he was gone. Rachel requested a full investigation. The park brought in experts, geologists to test for magnetic anomalies, physicists to measure energy fields, even a priest to perform a blessing. They found nothing scientifically unusual, but they did find the names, carved into trees along the trail, scratched onto rocks, even written in the dirt where spring runoff wouldn't wash them away. Dozens of names. Most matched missing hikers from decades past. Some dated back to the 1920s, when the park had first opened. All the names of people who'd entered the trail and never left. Rachel took it upon herself to research every name. She contacted families, read old reports, pieced together patterns. She discovered that disappearances on this particular trail came in clusters. Quiet for years, then 3 or 4 people would vanish in a single season. The pattern matched lunar cycles, specifically the new moon. Against direct orders, Rachel hiked the trail on the night of the next new moon. She went equipped with cameras, audio recorders, and a satellite phone for backup. Her supervisor had forbidden it, but some questions demanded answers. She saw them. Dozens of translucent figures walking the trail in endless loops. Some walked alone, lost in their own private hells. Others moved in groups, their mouths moving in conversation she couldn't hear. They passed through trees, through rocks, through Rachel herself when she didn't move aside fast enough. The sensation was like being submerged in ice water. Peter Stoll was there. He saw Rachel and approached her, his expression a mixture of hope and despair. "Can you see me?" he asked. "Really see me?" Rachel nodded, unable to speak. Peter laughed, a broken sound. "The first time in years. The living usually can't see us. But on new moon nights, the barrier thins. We become more real. And so do they." Rachel managed to ask. Peter pointed toward the dark forest. Something was moving between the trees, tall and spindly, its limbs too long and jointed in too many places. As Rachel watched in horror, it reached out and touched one of the spectral hikers, an elderly woman who'd been walking in circles. The woman's scream was silent, but her mouth opened in a perfect O of terror as she was pulled off the trail, through the underbrush and into the darkness. She vanished. That's what happens, Peter said quietly. We walk the trail forever, and they hunt us. When they catch us, we don't come back. I don't know where we go, but it's not death. Death would be a mercy. Rachel ran. She made it back to her vehicle, her recordings intact. The footage showed the spectral hikers clearly. The audio captured their voices, their warnings, their pleas for help. But the creatures that hunted them appeared only as distortions in the image, dark voids where light seemed to bend and break. Rachel submitted her evidence. The Park Service buried it. The trail was closed for 2 weeks under the pretense of bridge repairs, but it reopened on schedule. Closing it permanently would raise questions nobody wanted to answer. Better to let the occasional hiker vanish than to admit that something impossible was happening in America's national parks. Rachel still works as a ranger, but she's made it her mission to warn people. She can't tell them the truth outright. She'd be fired or worse. But she can encourage hikers to avoid that trail during new moons. She can tell them it's more dangerous then, that wildlife is more active, that the footing is worse in low light. Most listen, some don't. Last month, a young couple ignored her warnings and hiked the trail on the night of a new moon. They never came back. Their car is still in the parking lot, waiting. Rachel checks it every day, hoping they'll return to claim it, knowing they never will. Because she's seen the names carved into the trees recently, fresh cuts in old bark. Both names are there now. Rachel has started carving something of her own into the trees, a warning in code that only those who need to see it will understand. On a large oak at the trailhead, visible to anyone who knows to look, are 2 words she refreshes every month. Turn back. She doesn't know if anyone reads it. She doesn't know if it helps. But it's all she can do for the lost ones, walking their eternal paths, waiting for the dark things to finally catch them and drag them to whatever comes after. These 5 stories come from ranger debriefs, incident notes that never become press releases, and warnings passed quietly from veterans to rookie. Names and locations have been changed, but the pattern stays the same. Something out there doesn't want to be understood, only avoided. If you go into the wilderness, remember this. Nature follows rules we respect, even when we don't fully understand them. But there are places where those rules bend, where reality feels thin, where you can do everything right and still end up somewhere you can't explain. So if a ranger discourages you from taking a certain trail, listen. If they seem tense about a lake or a valley or a stretch of forest that should be fine, believe them. And if you ever encounter something inaccessible, something that hits you with sudden dread for no reason you can name, don't trust it. Don't investigate it. Don't try to prove it. Just leave quickly and don't look back. Because the wilderness is beautiful, but not everything in it is natural. If you want more true feeling backroad and wilderness stories like this, subscribe to The Faint Whisper. New uploads are coming. Quiet, cold, and waiting. Until next time, keep your flashlights charged, your radio close, and your eyes on the trail ahead. Good night, and tread carefully. Disclaimer: The Faint Whisper shares fictional horror and mystery stories told in a true feeling style for entertainment. These narratives are not presented as verified real events, and any resemblance to real people, places, or incidents is coincidental. Some visuals on this channel are created using AI generation tools. Viewer discretion is advised.